Hi, everyone. Today's mini learning and memory lecture is going to be about practice, feedback, and talent, right? So, some of the key behavioral concepts from our chapter on skill memory that you want to be aware of, right? Like last time, please, right, be familiar with the whole slide set. You want to know all the things from the chapter that I asked you to think about in the reading guide, right? But we're going to do more focused little check-ins in these videos. So please post on the discussion board if you have any questions on the major material from this chapter, right? Some of it is going to be familiar because we talked about procedural learning, right, which is the same thing as skill learning when we talked about HM, because that was something that he was still able to do. But this chapter digs a little bit more into the details, right? And so there's some similarities with declarative memory and declarative learning like we talked about, but also some important differences. So definitely make sure that you can distinguish those. Hopefully the activity that's associated with this chapter that you need to complete is also interesting. So again, in focusing on a few different areas today, I want you to think a little bit about the power law of practice, right? When we talked about this type of learning, even when we were back with HM, right, we talked about how practice is necessary to learn non-declarative or skill-based types of information, right? And the power law helps explain why developing a really deep expertise in something is actually pretty rare, right? If we look at this graph, this slide, this is a simple, just getting better at reading in terms of minutes per page read type of task. If you just have somebody practice reading over several days, right, we can see from day 1 to day 2, they cut that time in half, but then 5 additional days and they still quite haven't cut it in half again from 4 down to 2. So what we know in general about this type of learning is that with relatively little practice, we can get pretty good at a new skill. So we see big gains early when we think about this type of learning. But then to get even better, right, kind of each next step that we would want to take in learning takes more time than it did for that initial learning period. So really, when we think about becoming experts in something, there's a lot of practice that's required to go into gaining an advanced amount of skill in any type of skill-based learning, right? And in reality, right, very few people have the time, energy, and interest to become experts in skill based tasks, right? If any of you have spent time trying to learn an instrument when you were in school growing up, right, you probably got somewhat good relatively quickly. And then how good you got after that depended on how much time you put into practicing, right? A lot of young musicians plateau when their interest in working to get better starts to wane. I know that certainly happened with me learning to play guitar. I got a little bit good and then just could never push myself to get much better, right? And that's common with other types of skills too, like learning a new sport, right? Learning a new game, video games, right? If you play those, right, develop some level of comfort. But then to really, really get good, it takes a lot of practice to do that, right? Another really important factor is feedback, right? So, what can change the power law of learning really powerfully is getting feedback on performance. This can really shift how much we're able to learn. And it's important that it's quality feedback, it has to be meaningful feedback. So, this is example data from a participant learning to perform a martial arts type of kick move, where they're trying to get faster and faster at performing this move, right? And we can see in the top part here, kind of that classic power law of learning, right? Quicker gains and then starting to plateau, right? After a certain number of trials, right? And so it looks like they've kind of maxed out at that point, right? That's really starting to plateau. But then we add in In this case, seeing a film demonstrating additional techniques to refine the move that they're trying to learn. And with this additional feedback, it basically kicks in a second curve of learning where they then make another really rapid gain that then starts to plateau, right? So this is an example of how important feedback can be in improving skill-based learning, right? And so in general, we can kind of define feedback as getting knowledge of results while you're learning something, right? Something that tells you how well you're performing the skill that you're doing. So this is really old data on this effect. So Thorndike, who you've read about earlier in the semester, this is now almost 100 years old. And I've actually posted this paper for you on Canvas if you're interested. It's always interesting to read really old psychology papers like this, just to see what the writing was like. But this is also interesting because of its relevance to our chapter today. So Thorndike asked participants in this study to draw lines that were exactly 3 inches long while blindfolded. If you want to try and do that and see how difficult that is, you could have a little fun with that. But what he did in terms of the manipulation here was half the participants were given feedback, that is, they were told when they were within 1/8 of an inch, and the other half was not. Both groups were allowed to practice for the same amount of time, but only the group that got feedback actually got better, right? Feedback is really important for learning. If you want to think about stats, which I know you don't, right? But if you think about 290 and 291, this is why there's so many layers of feedback built into that class, because the skills you're building are really kind of cognitive skill memories, right? And so you read the book, you take an if at, you do an activity, you get the key and match up with your performance. You do the homework and you get feedback on that, right? Lots and lots of layers to make sure that you're incrementally building up those skills that you need to do data analysis in a meaningful way, right? Feedback is really, really important. Another thing I want to focus on for you today is a key model of skill memory, right? And so FITS model is something that I do want you to be familiar with. I want you to be able to try and think about how you would describe the different stages of FITS model in learning different skills. And so there's a couple examples for you here, right? He breaks down this into cognitive, associative, and autonomous stage. I think one thing that gets really tricky for students is that they want to put cognitive at the end because we always think of cognitive functions as being our higher level. But in FITS model, the cognitive stage is actually the bottom, right? This is when we're basically using a recipe or a list of instructions and following it in order to perform a task. So in this example, right, if any of you have ever set up a tent before, right, the first time you do that with any tent, you got to follow the instructions. First time you follow a new recipe, right, you're reading every step, every ingredient, and following that to the best of your ability. The more you practice something, FIT argues you move to the associative stage where you start to get stereotyped movements and actions, right? So in this example, you would get to the point where you could set up the tent, right, without using the instructions. You might still be, right, thinking about the order and checking yourself and making sure you're doing it right along the way, but you don't necessarily need the list of instructions in front of you at that point. And then finally, again, with more practice, you can get to the autonomous stage where your movements are really automatic and you don't need to consciously think anymore about what it is you're doing, right? So then this would be setting up a tent while carrying on a conversation, talking about something else. You're not really thinking about the tent. You're doing it pretty much automatically or autonomously at that point. Right? Another classic example of this is learning how to drive a car, right? Most of us have done that, right? Maybe not everybody, right? But most people learn how to drive at some point. And you can think about those stages and how awkward it is in the beginning when you're learning how to drive a car, right? If we think about that cognitive stage, right? You're a little clumsy with your movements in the beginning and everything's a little bit slow. You're always explicitly kind of rehearsing the things you need to do, right? When you get in the car, all right, where am I going to put my hands? Now I'm going to check my mirrors, right? Following those steps that you've been taught by the driving instructor, your parents, right? Or whoever it is that you've learned to drive a car from. right? With practice, we can start to stereotype those movements. They'll get a little bit smoother, right? We're able to, right, shift gears. If you're talking about manual transmission, right? Changing lanes, right, gets a little bit smoother. But you're generally still consciously thinking about the sequence of movements that you need to do, right? And monitoring how well you're doing and adjusting, right? But then we all get to the point where we can drive without really thinking about it. And that's when we start doing dangerous stuff like looking at our phone, right? Talking with people, singing, and closing our eyes and not really paying attention to the road, right? Dangerous stuff. But we can do that because we've learned the skill to the point where it's easy for us to do it without thinking about it, right? And this is why it takes time and practice to get there. This is why so many states have laws about when people can have other people in their car of certain ages, right after they learn how to drive, because they haven't had enough practice to get to that autonomous stage yet, right? They're not quite all the way there. So that kind of matches up with how we think about it. And then in that case, with some policy that gets enacted around what we think about learning how to drive a car. The last thing I want to talk about is talent versus effort, right? When we think about different skills we have, right, we talk about talent, we talk about practice and learning, but whatever your preconceived notions are, right, you want to make sure that you understand talent in this kind of psychological context in this case, right? So we all know people who seem to get really good at a new skill with pretty little effort, right? And we often would say that that person has a talent for that skill. And it's true that talent plays a role, right? Those who start off performing a skill well are more likely to end up becoming experts, right? There's some natural talent, like we say, that's there, right? That makes it maybe more interesting or more exciting for the person to practice and get better, right? If you start off being really bad at something, you have to really be motivated to learn it in order to push through that trouble, right? And so the question is this because that person has the right genes, right, to develop that expertise, or because that early success helped them, push through and stick with the intense effort that's required to learn a skill, right? Twin studies have been really, really useful at thinking about this, like how much is talent and how much is effort, right? So we can compare identical twins, monozygotic twins, to fraternal twins that are really just the same as siblings and see how much genetic impact there is on skill learning in general. So in this example study, right, we can take our identical and fraternal twins and look at their performance on this rotary pursuit task. So in this task, it's really simple, right? The person holds a little stylus and they have to keep it on a little kind of circle target that's on this spinning disc, right? So it's something that's really hard to do at first, and you practice and you get better. Kind of like, right, just like the mirror tracing task that we talked about with HM, right? And so in general, all participants get better at this skill with time, right? If we look over trials, they spend more time on target. But we can also tease out some genetic effects using the twin structure of this study as well. So identical twins are more similar in their performance than fraternal twins. This is the data that we see here. So on the y-axis is the degree of correlation, and that's the correlation between the twin pairs. And so across the whole length of the study, identical twins were consistently more similar to each other than fraternal twins. And that actually degree of correlation seems to go up. So that genetic effect actually teases out even more over time. At the beginning, right, there's still a separation, but they're relatively close. They're both kind of in the middle in terms of how related they are. But then the more practice that you get, those fraternal twins start to show a difference, right, where there's fairly low correlation between the twin pair scores. But the identical twins, right, get even more similar to each other. So there's big genetic effects related to talent. So there is some genetic impact, but effort is also really important, right? So this is a nice kind of summary of this idea from both sides. With the same amount of practice, talent is likely what separates two people's performance. So if you think about two unrelated individuals, both took piano lessons and practiced for 10 years, one is accepted to the prestigious music school Juilliard and the other is not, right? In that case, given the same amount of practice and effort, that difference is probably due to some genetic level of talent, right? On the other side, with the same talent, practice effects are evident, right? In this case, if we take two identical twins, one becomes a concert pianist and the other doesn't, right? This is more due to effort. They're identical twins, right? Their experience and practice, that difference is what's going to be the separation point there, because they're genetically essentially identical at that point. So both genetics and experience, right? Just like we've talked about nature and nurture, not nature versus nurture at this point. So we have genetic talents, but practice can also make a difference as well. All right, so that's some key behavioral aspects to think about. Remember, if you have questions on any of that or any of the stuff that you read about in the book, please post on the discussion board. The discussion boards have been very quiet. That's okay, but some of this stuff is tricky. I don't know what's tricky if you don't check in with me. So please do that. Otherwise, keep staying safe and let me know if there's anything I can do to help.